Welcome to this New America event. I'm Peter Bergen, Vice President of Global Studies and Fellows. It's really a great honor and privilege to introduce our guest, Mina Ahmed, who has written a brilliant book, A Matter of Trust, India-U.S. Relations from Truman to Trump, which got a rave review in the New York Times. Mina is a longtime journalist. She also worked at the World Bank. She has also been on the board of Doctors Without Borders and Turquoise Mountain, and she divides her time between the United States and India. She's also been a longtime supporter of New America. So we're really thrilled to have her today, particularly since we now have the results of the India election in, which obviously we're going to begin there because that's the topic du jour. So Mina, obviously Modi was supposed to win in a landslide. There was even suggestions that he would get a super majority in parliament, which would allow him to do pretty much anything he wanted. It didn't turn out that way. So how did it turn out, and what does it mean?
Well, thank you to New America and Peter, to you for giving me this opportunity to discuss my book, Matter of Trust, which is a 70-year history of the U.S.-India relationship and its many ups and downs. And I imagine it'll continue to be that way. Well, 2 days ago, on June the 4th, India once again reaffirmed to the world its commitment to democracy in the largest election the world conducted over 6 weeks, and in often very grueling conditions. Temperatures in Delhi and places in India reached 120 degrees. Now, the exit polls, if anyone was watching them, predicted a landslide, as you said, um, but uh, but they were off. And the Modi wave failed to materialize. Now, we had started getting some indications of this because I'd spoken to some people on the ground who are following, who've been following elections, and they had said that they weren't seeing the Modi wave, but uh, the exit polls were so completely contrary to that, that I think the BJP had become very confident. Anyway,
Mina, can I ask you why that's the case? Because I mean, exit polling in the US tends to be pretty accurate, even if polling before the election, for instance, if Hillary Clinton was regarded as a shoo-in, it didn't happen. But why were the exit polls off?
sure, but the people I've spoken to have said that the exit polls have been wrong before.
Okay.
They have often shown the general trend to be accurate. What's been different about this, and it was true, I believe, 2 elections ago, they got the trend completely wrong.
And for American listeners, I mean, it is important to, or viewers, it is important to understand this is a parliamentary system. It's not a presidential system. So,
It is. You need 272 seats to form a government. And the interesting thing was Modi had used as his campaign slogan, he had won 303 seats in the last election, and he had used as his campaign slogan that this time they were going to get past 400 in a coalition. And some of the people who I'd been following were saying that those numbers didn't add up, and it proved to be true. He actually didn't even make, on his own, the BJP only got 240 seats. They didn't even get the numbers to form a government on their own. So
okay.
now what he is faced with is a coalition. Now, this is very interesting. And even the coalition didn't even make it to 300 seats. Forget about the 400. They didn't even make it to 300. They got 294. He has two major partners in the coalition, and he is going to have to do a great deal of bargaining and horse trading, and they're going to end up being the kingmakers.
And
And
who are the partners and what are their what's their ideological makeup?
so the two partners are the chief ministers of Bihar and someone from the south in Karnataka, Chandrababu Naidu. And these people are secular. They do not subscribe to this necessarily to his, Hindutva image. And so I have a feeling that that's going to have to go on the back burner for a while. But what's interesting about Prime Minister Modi is that as chief minister in Gujarat and as prime minister for 2 terms, he has always had a majority. He is not used to a coalition. He is used to getting his own way. He's used to pushing through an agenda. So this is very new territory for him. And the question is, how capable is he going to be of managing a fractious coalition? Because Indian coalitions can be very fractious. And in the past, and this is in my book, the 70s, sometimes in the 70s, but in the 80s and 90s, you had a series of coalitions. Some of them only lasted a year, and the government would fall because they would constantly switch out and switch parties if they didn't get what they wanted.
Right.
Now, the Congress has been very used to managing coalitions, but his government is not used to managing coalitions. So one party, if they pull out because Congress offers them a better deal, his government could very well fall.
Is that a
So
live possibility? I mean, is it, because he doesn't have, just the BJP doesn't have enough votes to form a government, is what you're saying,
yes,
without this.
they don't have the votes to form a government on their own. So he cannot get anything through Parliament. He cannot get anything on his agenda done without the approval and the acquiescence and a buy-in from his coalition partners.
And he literally cannot be appointed prime minister, right? If he doesn't have a
He
majority.
cannot. No, he cannot.
So do you think that I mean, so as you say, these two minority parties are in the kingmaker position. I mean, what are they going to try and extract from Modi, and might they just pull out entirely?
Well, they met yesterday with Prime Minister Modi, and so the question is, what do they want?
Yeah.
They could ask for anything from Speaker of the House to the Home Ministry to to Ministry of Finance to all kinds of things. They want special status for their state, which means a big chunk of the budget. It's endless. And if they don't
Right.
get what they want, they could threaten to pull out and join Congress and bring the government down. So Modi is going to have to tread very, very carefully. And I think
Yeah.
that a lot of things that he had planned on are going to have to take second place to, keeping his coalition together and keeping himself in power.
And you make a very good point that he's only ruled in the majority in Gujarat when he was chief minister and when he was prime minister the last two times. And when he was prime minister the last two times, he was able to push through a lot of stuff, some of which was very popular, like the 110 million toilets and but he's obviously it's going to be a very different kind of
I
government.
mean, pushing, getting piped water and getting toilets actually was some of the really commendable things that the Modi government has accomplished. On the other hand, let's just look at Ram Mandir, which is something that you talked about, Peter, in your two sessions ago on your wonderful podcast, which I always learn so much from your podcasts. They're so informative and well done. And you talked about the implications of the Ram Mandir. Modi did not win the seat where the Ram Mandir is.
Oh,
So that should tell you.
and explain what the Ram Mandir is.
So there was a 15th century mosque that existed in Ayodhya, and this was a town. And he Modi had promised his supporters that because this was supposed to be the mythical birthplace of the Hindu god Ram, he now this is not proved anywhere. There's no evidence of this, and we don't even know whether this is a mythological person or a real person. I'm a Hindu, so I grew up believing in Ram, but there's no real evidence to show that this was the birthplace, although this is what they say in the epics. But we don't know exactly where he was born. So, but he said this mosque was going to be torn down, and they were going to build a temple in its place to Ram. And they tore down a mosque that was 500 years old.
And in
And
terms of
they,
the sequence, that was in 1992 by a sort of enraged mob.
yes,
Flash
but
forward to the beginning
it
of
was
this
very
year.
popular at the time. It helped propel Modi and his party into power.
Yeah.
And it politicized religion in a way. And so, you know, so he achieved that. Now, having delivered what he thought was a very big vote getting election item, what's surprising is he lost that seat. It didn't deliver the dividend he expected.
Well, I mean, to put a more final point on it, I mean, he started effectively his campaign in January of this year at the opening of that temple, right? The new temple, which is $240
Which
million.
I actually did think quite unusual. He conducted the rites in the temple, which are generally reserved for Brahmins only, the upper caste, and he's not an upper caste person or a priest.
Right.
But so the other thing that he did was when he got the BJP got anxious when the voter turnout was lackadaisical, and it looked like the voter turnout was going to be not as high as the last time, and they made the election campaign. They felt that they had to drive out the vote, and so they used religion again to try and drive people out. And he used very divisive language,
Yes.
so, about the Muslims to get the vote out.
To
The
be,
flip
to be precise, he described them as infiltrators, even though they've been in India for.
traders, but he also said that if Congress comes in, they're going to redistribute your wealth to the Muslims, they're going to take your gold, and they're going to take your Mangal Sutra. And the Mangal Sutra is a necklace which is the engagement ring, it's the equivalent of the Indian engagement ring. And so what was it was sort of shocking, actually, the terminology he used. There were complaints by 20,000 people signed a letter to the election commission saying that they should ban him from this inflammatory, this kind
Yeah.
of, but no action was taken by the election commission.
Well,
Anyway,
it seems to
anyway,
have backfired me completely. I mean,
the
he,
speech where he in Rajasthan, where he came out with that speech, he also lost that seat.
but so, I mean, let's dig into that a bit because, I mean, yeah, not only did he not win, I mean, he's actually sort of suffered a really kind of a not insignificant loss, arguably, because, I mean, these two minority parties that you describe, which are the kingmakers, I mean, they could change their minds, and obviously they're going to have a lot of power in whatever the next government is if they don't change their minds. But why did it backfire so badly? Because on a lot of levels, you know, some things well. This is a guy who's polling at 75%, which is like, think about it, that's like no American president has polled at that number since just after 9/11 when Bush got a 90%, but that was because of the 9/11 attacks. I mean, he was the most popular leader in the world by most polling data. He'd done a lot for a lot of people. Obviously, there were Muslims who weren't happy with what the kind of Hindu first. But why did this backfire so badly?
So I think, people are going to be analyzing this data for time
Yeah,
and don't have all the information in yet. But, from some of the people that I've been following and the commentators that I've been following, well, one big thing that is obvious is employment. He was
yeah,
not able to deliver on employment. Everyone talks about the demographic dividend in India. The population in India at 1.4 billion has now surpassed China's. But the question is, are there jobs for these young people that are entering the workforce? Modi promised to create 20 million new jobs every year, but he's fallen far, far short of that. So
yeah,
that's one big problem. The second big problem is inflation, just in the way that it was a problem here. But in India, there's been inflation. There's been a steep rise in some prices in critical areas with food. So that's been a big problem. And that affects a lot of poor people.
yeah.
So, I think that in the end, people don't care about religious politics if they don't have a guarantee of jobs, and if they don't have and what's really remarkable about this election, and I have to emphasize this, is it really shows India's commitment to democracy, that you cannot buy the Indian voter, because under this government, he had put in place very extensive welfare schemes where, because India is quite ahead on digitization, and we have to give Modi credit for that,
Yeah.
although it was started in the previous regime. He really accelerated it, and he was able to transfer direct payments for people who earned under a certain amount. And despite handing out free food, um, people still did not give him their vote. So that
Yeah.
tells you.
Well, I want to ask you a little bit about that. So 1.4 billion population, about almost a billion people who could have voted. The 1.1 billion Hindus, 220 million Muslims, and then other minorities and certain sort of ethnic groups. I mean, based on and I know it's just a day since all this happened, but does that mean that a lot of Hindus didn't vote for Modi?
Well, India is 80% Hindu, so
Yeah,
just looking at the vote count, if Congress, if the Congress Alliance got 40.6% of the vote,
right.
that's almost half the country. And
Yeah.
the Modi Alliance, the BJP Alliance, got 42.8% of the vote. So
So
it's pretty
it,
evenly
it,
split.
yeah, so it seems like a real upset, not just a sort of
Real
like a
upset. So there are plenty of Hindus that didn't vote for him. And I think
yeah.
that there's plenty of Hindus that are tired of the divisive politics. They want employment, they want, they want other things, and
Well,
they
going back to that celebration at the Ram Temple where Modi acted as both a politician because he literally launched his campaign right after the temple was inaugurated,
right.
and it was a big deal, and Bollywood celebrities came, and I think they put 10, it was a big event. It was covered on every TV station, and it seemed like a very popular thing amongst a lot of Hindus. But there's a bunch of people. I mean, I'm going to make a presumption a little bit here, Mina, about yourself, who are like, well, wait a minute, you know, here's a guy who's a politician who's also presenting himself as a priest, who's been making these like very demeaning comments about Muslims and calling them infiltrators. I mean, I'm presuming that there's a fairly large group of, let's say, not necessarily secular Muslims, but they understand that it was created as a secular state with equality of religion, and that's been the basis of a very successful country for quite a long time. I mean, on paper, India shouldn't work at all, right? Because it's got 100 languages and multiple religions, and it came out of a terrible civil war with Pakistan. Uh, is that, is that your dog, Mina?
Sorry.
I heard a sound. I'm sorry. Uh, uh, but anyway, so the point is that Sunil Kalani, who Mina, and wrote the great book, The Idea of India, that idea what has been very successful for India, and whereas Hindu first is sort of a uncharted territory.
So, you know, both the US and India, had when they were founded, made a commitment to secularism, a belief in free and open elections, civil liberties, free speech. So they had all this in common. The founding fathers of in India's, when India became independent, they modeled India on Western liberal, democratic ideals.
Yeah,
So, India was always a secular democracy, and even Gandhi and Nehru understood that in a multicultural society, you had to embrace and include everyone or you couldn't progress. Now, they picked a path, and I've described this in the book. When Nehru came, he picked an economic path of socialism because he somehow was convinced that that was the path out of poverty. And it didn't work out. Um, on the other hand, there were other things he did, which is invested a lot of capital into developing the IITs and medical institutes and education of higher education, which is paying dividends today.
Right.
Which is, this is how Silicon Valley and all our tech engineers have pulled India out of poverty. It's not agricultural policy that pulled India out of poverty. It's India's vast software, and it's the people who um, are educated, and the people who studied at all these universities that Nehru built that have pulled India out of poverty. It's tech dividend, and so I think that they pursued different policies, but what Modi, I don't want to I don't want to blame Modi for everything. Modi has seen a lot of growth. There's been 7% growth and under Modi, but it started under Manmohan Singh. What he doesn't do is give credit to his predecessors. Now, maybe no politicians give credit to their predecessors, but all these reforms, whether it was digitization, the Aadhaar card, all of this started under the Manmohan Singh regime.
And tell us what the Aadhaar card is, because it's quite interesting for.
Every single Indian was has an identity card, and it was all digitized, and this is quite a revolution for India, but it enabled Indians to receive payments and all kinds of other access to goods and services. So it really revolutionized everything, and it started slowly, but Modi really helped accelerate the process. So we have to give him credit for some of those things.
Let me ask you about because there was sort of Modi is popular. I mean, he is obviously not done well in this election relative to expectations, but just as I mean, Trump and Modi are two very different people, but like, all over the world, whether it's Erdogan in Turkey or Meloni in Italy, or, pick your country, Putin in Russia, there is this sort of nationalist kind of strain that is doing well. And there's no need to go into the reasons for that. They tend to be, in every country there are specifics, but there are some overall reasons for it. So the question I have about Modi for you, Meena, is it would be easy to sort of, because he's been a member of the RSS, which was sort of the paramilitary social movement, and of the BJP, basically since he was a very young man. He never really got married. He had a sort of starter marriage that he never didn't seem to be consummated. He's sort of married to the cause of Hindu first. So it would be easy to say, well, it's Modi who's really been pushing this. But is it in fact that there's actually sort of a demand signal amongst a lot of Hindus who sort of say, well, yeah, we are tired, we were colonized by the Muslims and then the British, and we really want a Hindu first nation. So is he really is he driving this, or is public demand for these sorts of policies which tend to make Muslims second-class citizens? Is that something that another politician would respond to if it wasn't Modi?
I think there's certainly a certain segment in India that responds very well, that responds positively to Modi's message. There's no
Yeah.
question. And accounted for his popularity. Whether they were willing to walk the entire way with Modi into the RSS camp and get militant about it, I view super aggressive policies against the Muslims. I don't know. I think that they would fall short of that. When the Hinduism.
Well, maybe this election is a partial answer to that question.
So yes, I think election will be a partial answer to that. I'm wondering whether that's even the right question to ask.
Right.
I think the jury is out on that. I think people lived for years under a secular system and didn't seem to have this great desire for any kind of militant form of Hinduism. There was a small minority
Yeah.
and the fringe minority. Modi has got a very, very good PR propaganda machine, and he's managed to sell a certain image to India very effectively. And it's expanded the base that subscribes to this image. But in the end, when you have 220 million Muslims in a country, that's the third largest Muslim population in the world after Indonesia and Pakistan,
Yeah.
and bigger than most countries in Europe, you have to include them.
Yeah.
Then disappear. So anyway, I think that the conclusion that I've come away from this election is that India's commitment to democracy is strong, and that is actually what has always made India unique and attractive to America. Because India's commitment to democracy, even in 1947, when it became independent, India had lots of issues with America. They were constantly at loggerheads, as my book talks about. They had lots of differences, but India's commitment to democracy is what always kept its friendship with America strong. There were always people in Congress willing to support America. There were always people in the US government willing to support America because it was democracy. It was a democracy. And you have this landscape where, you have military dictatorships, strong men in Pakistan, and you have Russia, which is communist. You have China, which is communist. You have Myanmar. So you have this whole area which is surrounded, this whole landscape of communists and strongmen, and then you have India, which is completely committed to democracy. It was a beacon.
Well, let me ask you about that because, one thing Modi has done, forget about the question of Muslims and some of the laws that were being enacted that would prevent Muslims from having sort of special immigration status if they were coming from neighboring countries, etc. But as I understand it, you tell me where I'm wrong. I mean, Modi has presided over a situation where non-governmental organizations and have come under a lot of pressure, civil society organizations. There isn't really a vibrant independent media because it's been sort of co-opted by either Modi supporters, or there's some sort of version of self-censorship amongst the major media. The space for independent media and for independent civil society organizations seems to have constricted. Is that A, true? And B, if it is true, now that Modi is really not in the driver's seat in quite the same way, do you anticipate that things might change?
Yes, I think this election has given hope to all the liberals and also hope to a lot of people, because what Modi had started to do was convert India from a democracy to an autocracy.
Yeah.
And
Or maybe might it be to use for Fareed Zakaria's term, a liberal democracy, because
an illiberal democracy.
obviously with this election, we see that the election side certainly is working.
The election is working, that's for sure. But the media was very intimidated. And much of the mainstream media is now owned by business people who basically pay lip service to Modi,
Yeah.
including the television station that I used to work for, NDTV.
That's the biggest TV
Which is the
station.
biggest and the most well-known for being independent.
Yeah. And now
He
it's a shadow of its former self. I mean, is that right?
shadowed his former self, but he made sure that his right-hand business person, Gautam Adani, um, bought it over. And so there was no independent media. There are a few pockets left, but there wasn't any real independent media left. And so I think this is going to give hope to a lot of people who will now feel free again to talk about Modi, to be critical of the government. Let What's really critical of this is Modi, when he had a majority in parliament and with his alliances, when they had such a super majority, um, he really controlled everything and people were scared and intimidated. Now there are lots of actors you can go to. So one, you have a very healthy opposition, which is always good for a democracy. They have almost half the seats in parliament. Secondly, you have these two kingmakers. So if you're
Right.
unhappy with Modi or you're unhappy with the policy, you have people like Chandrababu Naidu, one of his alliance persons, or you have members in the opposition like Mamta Banerjee from Bengal, who you can go to and complain to. And
And
these
he,
people have
and
enough,
what about the Congress? I mean, did they do well in these?
but they have enough power now that these guys can fight for you. They
Because
didn't have a
mean,
real.
it seemed, I mean, I don't know Indian politics, particularly, but it seemed like the Congress party was almost dead on, like had really just,
Survived. And what's really interesting is that I'm hearing from a lot of sources that Rahul Gandhi's Jodo Yatra, which is the walk he did through India,
yeah.
was very effective. I
Huh.
think there were a lot of people that he touched. And he, by walking his way through India, he met a lot of ordinary people. And I think they really felt that he cared. And they really felt he went up in their estimation. He was no longer the son of, he
Right.
became his own politician. And apparently his popularity, I don't know because I'm not there, but I gather from what I'm hearing is that his popularity has really risen. So I think Modi, there's always an anti-incumbency factor also at work here.
Right.
When you've been in power for 10 years, there's a little bit of Modi fatigue with some people. Some people like change. So there's that factor as well. And so I think 5 years from now, let's see how he handles the coalition. If the coalition proves to be somewhat shaky, if there's a lot of factious infighting, um, you don't know and whether it even lasts 5 years. And if it doesn't last 5 years, well, they have someone like Rahul Gandhi. If he plays his cards right, maybe
Right.
people need to try him out. It's not so much that they want him, but the people just like a change sometimes.
Indeed. Let me ask you, so Modi, your for a couple of things for the audience. One is if you have a question, put it in the Slido. Two, if you want to buy the book, it's this Matter of Trust. It's the Amazon link is the bottom of your screen. But let me turn now to your book, which is, got this rave review in the New York Times and is a definitive account of the U.S.-India relationship from Truman to Trump, obviously. So Modi now, he's on the world stage. People at the White House know that he's not, that he's been somewhat damaged in this process. He's not, he didn't win a supermajority. He's part of a coalition. He'll be dealing with President Biden, and then in November or in January, it could be President Trump again, with whom I think he had a pretty strong relationship, it seems. How would you define sort of the Biden Modi relationship, the Biden India relationship, and what a second Trump term might do in terms of changing that, if at all? And how does that all fit into the bigger themes of your history?
So before we move to that, I just want to mention one thing. I had a conversation with someone who was in the civil service in India. This when Modi, as an all-powerful figure of a large majority, had managed to intimidate not just the press, but even the civil service had fallen into line. And
Uh,
I was told that given the fact that he hasn't got a majority now, and that things could change and everything's fluid, the civil service tends to be very, very risk averse. And that the civil service now is no longer going to simply just bend to his will. And the civil service is very powerful in India. That they are now, if Modi sends down a directive, they're going to want to have everything in writing. And they're going to want to have, they're not just going to bend to his will, they're going to try and evaluate whether this is going to have any impact in the future because no one wants to go to jail over things that they did for Modi. So having said that, that may translate into the arena of foreign affairs. I think Biden, who has seen Modi's weakness now, may be more willing to be critical of his human rights record than he was before, because
Mm.
they overlooked it. Now, why is India so important to the US? We all know that it's important to the US because of China. So China is the big factor in the US-India relationship. And just to give you a small little rundown of history, it's in my book, but in 1947, when India became independent, Nehru was a big friend of China. He tried to convince the US to accept mainland China as the representative of China as opposed to Taiwan. He pushed for it to be accepted at the UN. He was constantly trying to speak for China and on
Right.
China's behalf until 1962, when the Chinese invaded India and basically, you know, defeated India. And that
Mina, on that point, just because for a lot of people won't recall this, I mean, it was a border dispute that got bigger than, I mean, when you say it was a war, how big a war was it? I mean, was it a relatively quickly resolved border dispute that got out of hand, or how?
withdrew unilaterally. Let's just put it that way.
What's
They,
that?
the Chinese withdrew unilaterally.
Okay.
And so there was, but not before they psychologically damaged India terribly. I mean, till today, people think about that as a very big humiliation in India.
Was it
Everyone,
over Sikkim, or what was it? What was the cause?
well, it was a border clash.
Okay.
They had never settled the border. And even now, the border is not, it's a 3,000-mile border that's not been settled. The most recent clash took place in 2020. It's the first time in a long time where India actually lost some soldiers. So the flip-flop happened 10 years later. Anyway, that was a time when the US began to see India as a frontline state against communist expansionism. And JFK, President Kennedy, and his ambassador to India, Galbraith, were big supporters of Nehru. And it was sort of the turning point in relations. They did everything they could to help India during the 62 war. And I think the relationship would have really changed for the better, but Kennedy was assassinated and Nehru died 2 years later. Um, Under Mrs. Gandhi, 10 years later, Kissinger and Nixon are now trying to make friends with China, and they use Pakistan as a conduit. And Mrs. Gandhi and Nixon, and I've described this in my book, the personalities, it was just, you know, oil and water. They just did not get along for various reasons. And I
You
think,
have this great picture of them sort of just ignoring each other in the book.
yeah, but it was much, much more vile than that, actually.
Right.
They literally couldn't stand to be in the same room together.
Right. I mean, they don't look very happy in this picture, which was a publicity picture, pretty clearly.
And so then there were a lot of reasons for that. And, but so there was a flip-flop, initially it was India that was friends with China and promoting China under Nehru until the 62 war. And then it was the US that was friends with China, and China was India's big enemy. Anyway, there was a flip-flop. Now, um, the US and India seem to be on the same side. And the person who really recognized this as a problem was George Bush. I mean, I know that this is going to be a surprise to a lot of people, but George W. Bush began to understand that China, the rise of China, was going to be an economic threat. And he began to befriend India. And he's the
That's
one,
very interesting because, of course, George H.W. Bush was the U.S. ambassador to China. And as a
right,
young man, George W. Bush was spending a fair amount of time in China.
right. but and that was the time when everyone was praising all the sort of big, the entry of China into the global workspace and everything. But George
Yeah.
Bush began to see that this would be a problem. It was also the same time that the Indian diaspora in the US had started to become very wealthy and very powerful and wanted better US-India relations and started to promote that. And George Bush pushed through the nuclear deal, and that single-handedly changed the relationship and turned it around. So Manmohan Singh, the prime minister previous to Modi, and George W. Bush pushed through this relationship that turned the relationship around.
And
And
why was the nuclear deal so important, Mina?
well, because India wanted to be recognized as a responsible nuclear power. India
Right.
had developed nuclear weapons, but had been treated as a pariah. They had been ostracized from the nuclear supplies group. They had been ostracized, um, over and over again. And they said, look, unlike China that's proliferated, unlike other countries like Pakistan that's proliferated, we have been a very responsible country and we're not getting any credit for it. We just want to be accepted and be treated with respect. And Bush, what President Bush said, what do the Indians want? And the Indians said, this is what we want. And he said, okay, let's do it. And it was almost like a thriller, at least I think it was like a thriller, and I try to describe it in my book, where the negotiations fell off the table several times, sank into the toilet practically. The prime minister and president themselves had to retrieve it and pull it out. There was a time when Condoleezza Rice was like, if the Indians don't want to do this, hell with them, and people walked out of meetings, and it was just quite dramatic. But um, in the end, it all came together, and it came together, and the whole relationship turned around, and years of mistrust, years of suspicion between the Indians and the US melted away, and they were able to build the relationship that we now take for granted.
Yeah.
Now, the one thing I will say is that the third leg to this, and what made the big difference, was George Bush, the diaspora. And the third leg was that India had undertaken massive reforms in the 90s and moved away from the socialist economy that Nehru had put into place and that Indira Gandhi had continued. And they had completely, you know, changed the economy, and they had begun to emerge as a global power. They'd done away with
Right.
the socialist policies that moved into the new global order. And when they reformed their economic policies, they began to grow.
Right.
And once you
And
emerge
obviously,
as a global power, the world starts paying attention to you.
and I mean, obviously, the Chinese made kind of very similar decision, not in roughly in the same time frame, uh, but the operating theory in the United States and elsewhere was the Chinese will liberalize economically and then they'll liberalize politically, which kind of the opposite happened. I mean, they're more repressive today than they were, before Tiananmen Square, arguably. So, in India, the
They have the economic power for them to be able to do that. And now they're willing to challenge the US everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, what is the state of play between India and China right now? I mean, India has also got a very aggressive defense build-up policy, is my understanding, and a very aggressive and a very robust domestic defense industry, and is looking to, move into a blue water navy, and it obviously it has nuclear weapons, so how would you describe the nature of that relationship? I mean, it's pretty tense, reasonably okay for the moment. Do the Indians care about Taiwan? How would you sort of describe the relationship?
Well, I think India has a slightly schizophrenic relationship when it comes to China. China, as you know, it's no longer sort of hiding and biting anymore. That used to be
Right.
their strategy. Under Xi, it's a very muscular, aggressive foreign policy. They now want to participate in, establishing the rules of the global order in the world. And so they're willing to take on the US. India has watched China's rise, and Modi, in particular, is a great admirer of strongmen, and he admires Xi. I think he'd very much like to follow China's example. I mean, India has China envy. I mean, he'd like to emulate China in many ways, but he he he's trying to find a way to do that. So Jaishankar has pursued a foreign policy based, which is very transactional. So India established a policy of non-alignment when it was founded. It was the bedrock foundational principle. And this is something that got them into a great deal of grief with the US in the beginning. And it got them into grief because India came out of colonialism, and their last thing they wanted to do was yoke themselves onto the backs of another Western power. The world, however, had just, in 1947, had just basically divided itself into two factions in the Cold War. The Cold War had descended, and the way that Truman looked at the world and John Foster Dulles, who was Eisenhower's Secretary of State, the way they looked at the world was, you're either with us or against us. The world was black and white to them. Russia was the evil empire, and you were either against the communists or with us. Nehru didn't see the world that way. He felt that India should be neutral. He also firmly believed that there should be neutral spaces where the world conflicts could be resolved. He saw himself as a world statesman. And he got actively involved in the Korean War, which is something that a lot of people don't know about, but India had played a very active role in the prisoner of war exchange. It's in my book. India was involved in the Suez Crisis. He helped Eisenhower in the Suez Crisis. He was very against nuclear weapons. He tried to campaign against people getting nuclear weapons. So his was moral politics. Jaishankar is, if you may, Jaishankar practices real politics. It's much more transactional. They're silent on Ukraine. They haven't really helped the U.S. on any issues that the U.S. has wanted them to get involved in. When it comes to, so I don't know, when it comes to Taiwan, whether India will actually do anything to help the U.S. or not, because it means antagonizing China. And
Right.
China sits on India's 3,000-mile border, and China can threaten India. So why would India take that risk? So
I mean,
Jaishankar,
can I just return to the book just for a second because we've got a query about it that has come in. The So you've sort of told a little bit of quite a lot of the story. So we have the Nehru, the non-alignment, the sort of like that early, and then we come to JFK, Nixon, and can you just walk us through just a little bit more of the JFK, Nixon, uh, kind of that part of the story?
um, so after JFK and Nehru died, you had Indira Gandhi come in. And Mrs. Gandhi initially came to the US. India had suffered its worst famine in 1965. I mean, its worst famine, two back-to-back famines. And she desperately needed help. India was, at that point, always had its hands out. And the socialist policies were not helping. Um, but like every country, foreign policy is sometimes dictated by its internal domestic politics. When she arrived, Johnson, who had just taken over, was very charmed by Mrs. Gandhi and said, we're going to have to do everything we can to help her. And she had stopped in Paris, had her hair done, had got herself all dressed up for the occasion. Anyway, she charmed Johnson. And then she went back to India, and the Communist Party, talk about coalitions, threatened to pull their support from her government. And they were giving her a hard time. They thought they could control her. Then the old guard in her party thought they could control her. So she had to come out and make a statement against Vietnam. And so she made a statement against Vietnam, against the US policy in Vietnam. And Johnson saw this. And to him, any criticism about Vietnam was anathema. As you know, he was a one-term president because of Vietnam. And so after that, he just cut off, he just said, we're not going to do anything for India. And he cut off all aid. And his food
Huh.
policy, he began to monitor every ship of grain that went to India and only let it arrive just at the moment where people would starve. It became,
Wow.
it was absolute. I mean, I've described it in the book. It's just, it was unbelievable. Indians never forgot, at least Indians who grew up in that era never forgot this, that he used, he used food and starvation as a tool of his foreign policy. And so Indian opinion turned very anti-American at that time. And Mrs. Gandhi, there's a famous thing where she's on a phone call trying to beg to get this ship released. And when she gets off the phone, she said, we have got to become self-sufficient in grain because I never want to beg from America again. And
Wow.
so, it it's the relationship, she just became anti-American and the relationship deteriorated.
And
And
then
Nixon
the
came in.
the Green Revolution that happened then was
That
help.
spurred the Green Revolution. She took her agricultural minister, and I mean, there are too many details up for this conversation,
Right.
but she took the agricultural minister on a plane and they went all over India. And that's when they really accelerated the Green Revolution. Well, you know what? Johnson's policies may have helped India attain self-sufficiency in
And
food
wasn't the Ford Foundation very involved in that to some degree?
to some degree, but there were, others.
Yeah. Okay, so uh
So
self-sufficiency.
then comes
Pat,
Nixon and Nixon and Kissinger, and that is when really the relationship just gets to its worst possible point.
right.
That
And
is
you know,
about
and Pakistan is always sort of part of this because after all, India's for
because consistently the U.S. opted to align itself with Pakistan at India's expense. They would give them fighter jets at India's expense. They wouldn't sell things to India and that they would sell to Pakistan. And India would constantly point out that, look, who are they going to use them against? Not terrorists, they're going to use them against us. We fought 3 wars against
but
them.
of course, you know, Pakistan today, you hear the exact opposite of that, probably.
Right. So but regardless, I mean, it created a lot of bad blood. And when India won that Bangladesh war, I think it angered Nixon, it angered Kissinger no end that she was triumphant.
So fast forward to sort of Ford, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton. I mean, what were those years like?
Um, well, I think Clinton really laid the groundwork. He tried he, Cargill, which was when Pakistan tried to threaten India with nuclear weapons in Kargil. That was a big shakeup. Stoked Albert was very responsible for trying to help sort that out. And, Clinton really played a big role. But Vajpayee, who was actually a BJP person, was in power at the time. And they they tried so hard to convince the BJP at the time that we're actually your friends. We've decided we actually trust India more than Pakistan, and we want to actually open up things with India and change this relationship. And India was now beginning to emerge as a global economic power because the reforms were being undertaken. But I think India wasn't buying it at that point. There
So,
was too
but
much distrust between the two countries. It would take a little time. And
but the
they
Clinton folks.
started to lay the groundwork then. And Bajpai, by the way, was a brilliant man. He was highly educated, and he was a secular BJP person, and he ran a very successful coalition. The Bajpai government stayed in power from, well, he had one very short stint, but then later on, he came back from 98 to 2004. And he ran a very successful coalition. And everyone's talking about now whether Modi can do what Vajpayee did.
Just in the few minutes we have left, let's talk about, the Biden India Trump relationship, kind of the epilogue to your book, and the possible Biden second term Trump relationship. I mean, it seems that India and the United States have a lot of common interests, and which are not defined by whether Biden's in power or Trump's in power. Do you expect these common interests to kind of, or flash forward 10 years, let's say it's President Kamala Harris or President Tom Cotton, or, I mean, what's the trajectory of this relationship?
Well, I think if you look back over the last decade or 2 decades, I think you'll see that the India-U.S. relationship has progressed steadily and improved and gotten better and better, regardless of who's been prime minister or who's been president.
Right.
And I think that is a testament to their common interests, shared interests. One is China. Then the other is the Quad, which is now becoming a more muscular entity in the Far East. Although China now, I think, has started to refer to the region as Asia Pacific and not the Indo-Pacific, because they want to try and excommunicate India out of the region.
Just like we refer to Indo-PACOM as opposed to PACOM, now that we're
But anyway, I think that the one thing that, government to government, State Department to Ministry of External Affairs, I think the relationships are well established. I think the Defense Department and the Pentagon have got very, very close relationships now. I think there's a lot of cooperation. India has started to now diversify away from Russia very successfully from their their arms, and they've been buying steadily from the Europeans and from America. And so I think they're not as dependent as they used to be on the Russians for their supplies. So I think that there is a huge amount of cooperation. Trade between the two countries, I think, is the same as China's now. So it's only going to get, I think it's going to stay that way for the foreseeable future.
There's a strong possibility that there will be an Indian American prime minister, president, in the next decade or so. Whether that,
Yeah, I know some people who want to try.
well, no, but really, Nikki Haley could easily become president,
Yes, Nikki Haley always
and Kamala Harris is half Indian,
did.
and
Subject of
she could very
yeah.
easily become president. So,
Got a
how
couple
that.
of them featured in my next book.
Well, tell us about your next book.
My next book is called Indian Genius, and it's the meteoric rise of Indians in America. And I've profiled, basically focused on places where Indians have really made a difference: tech, medicine, and public policy. And I've tried to focus on 5 individuals in each that have been exceptional, that have really added to their area, and showed how they became successful. So if you want to know
Well,
how to be successful, you gotta read
and
about
what is the
them.
timeline on that book?
Um, yeah, okay.
No, tell me, so you finished writing it pretty much, and I mean, when is
Yeah,
it going to
yeah,
be
it'll be
published, you think?
published. Hopefully, it'll come out in the U.S. early February.
Great.
But
Well, congratulations on that. And we're at time. A reminder: the book is a matter of trust. You can buy it with the on your screen. we really want to thank Mina for a brilliant presentation, A, about the current election, and B, about her current book. So Mina, thank you, and thank you to the audience for tuning in.
Well, thank you so much to New America and to Peter.